Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is not every day we get to have a college tennis expertise here on the channel, but today we have the infamous John Parsons from J Tweets Tennis from the No Ad No Problem podcast, and a frequent guest, I would say, on the Cracked Rackets channel. But John has been gracious enough to join us all the way from the Bay Area today, ladies and gentlemen. So, John, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the warm intro.
Absolutely. And the reason why we brought you on today is we've done a lot of college tennis tours. We've done a lot of interviewing of college tennis players, but in terms of the match play and following the abundance of college tennis matches throughout the country, you are the guy. You are the number one kind of source to go for all this information. And you're definitely our source when it comes to that information as well. So, John, let's just get straight into it. What have you thought of the college tennis season so far overall as a whole?
I think it's been a really exciting one. I think there's a few factors that are contributing to college tennis being at its peak level right now in these kind of 2020 years. You see the success that people are having immediately on the pro tour, like a Ben Shelton already in the top 50 of the ATP, like Peyton Stearns in the top 100 of the WTA. Both of those players winning the NCAA singles championship less than a year ago.
Mhm.
And so I think that that adds a lot of intrigue and curiosity from outside of the college tennis world on college tennis and who are those next players. And you're also seeing, we have multiple years of eligibility right now still flowing into the college tennis game. So we have players with 5 years of eligibility because of that COVID extra year. And what that means is that the depth has never been stronger, right? You have 5 classes of players in college tennis. So we're continuing to ride what I think is a really exciting golden age of college tennis. And it's been really fun to follow it extremely closely and kind of share thoughts and opinions throughout 2023.
It's unbelievable too, and just seeing some of what these players, not just as players, but as people as well, have to offer to the game of tennis is something quite special. And hopefully, we're able to highlight that in our journeys and being able to talk about it on a more frequent basis, like these other college sports that get a lot of the attention. And I wanted to touch on, you kind of mentioned it already, players that have already made an impact on the pro tour that played college tennis, that were NCAA champions, that were team champions as well, played for the biggest programs in the country or maybe in the world when it comes to education wise. So my first question to you is, who do you think is more likely to go pro next year in college tennis? Because we've seen a little bit already with Diana Schneider. We've seen it
Yeah.
a little. We've seen it with Chloe Beck this past week, who's playing 100K in Charleston, who just beat Elizabeth Mandlik. What was it? 0-1?
1-0, but yeah.
1-0. It
Mhm.
and is she missing the ACCs for this?
Well, she has a quarterfinal match tomorrow against Peyton Stearns there in Charleston. So she will likely miss Duke's quarterfinal match against Georgia Tech tomorrow.
Just to think that you can balance a pro life and education and a college sports environment is quite something. So, is there anyone else besides the two that I've mentioned that are going to make that jump to the pros, or you see that potential going on to the pro tour, whether that's a man or a woman?
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned Diana Schneider. I think that is sort of the one to, circle. She's already in the WTA top 100. I'll say this, though. We saw last season, you saw both Ben Shelton, Peyton Stearns, and Emma Navarro all leave college tennis early. I'll make a prediction. I don't think we see anyone leave college tennis early this
Okay.
summer. Now, I think there might be players who don't take advantage of their 5th year of eligibility.
Okay.
So, players who have a COVID year. On the men's side, you look at number one, Elliot Spizzirri of Texas. He is the number one player in the country. He's also part of number one team in the country. You could see a world where if he goes on, the team goes on to have success in Orlando this year. Maybe he doesn't come back for his 5th year. I would also circle a player like Stefan Dostanic of
Mhm.
USC, who started this season as the number one player in the country. They might not take that 5th year. They might say, hey, I've done 4 years of college, even if it was abbreviated by COVID, I'm kind of ready for that next step. But I think in terms of the freshmen or sophomores, I think we're going to see everyone come back.
Okay. And that also brings to mind another guy that had a lot of junior success that just made his, I think, first practice at USC. Lerner,
Yeah, Learn
who's
Tien.
Lerner Tien, and he's been a name that we've been, and I think a lot of people that know the tennis world and know the college tennis world know about Lerner. And for him, what can you tell us about him in terms of he's eligible now to play Pac-12 championships, to play NCAAs, and will he? Do we think we'll see him kind of go from that 1-2 year spot to then going pro, or is it too early to tell?
I think it's a little early to tell. I mean, I think when he won Kalamazoo last year in 2022, I think the expectation was that he was not going to college. And then he
Okay.
played pro events throughout the fall and probably didn't have that level of success that maybe he was hoping to have. Decided to go to college at USC for the spring semester, had
Mhm.
eligibility issues, is now eligible, which is great to see. I think Lerner has can benefit a lot from college. And I think he can benefit a lot from the physical maturity that people have in college. I think he has a lot of tools in his game as a lefty that he probably can, continue to grow into over the next year. I anticipate we'll see him play a pretty heavy pro schedule throughout the summer and the fall. A lot of the, 25K, maybe challengers in the US. I think we'll see Lerner come back. I think we'll see him play a full collegiate season. I think potentially he won't be eligible for the NCAA singles tournament this year. So
Oh,
you
okay.
can envision a world where he comes back in 2024, tries to play that, maybe use that US Open wildcard if he wins that event
Hmm.
as kind of a launching pad for his pro career.
And does that include his doubles eligibility as well?
Yeah, so unfortunately, to be eligible for the NCAA singles and doubles championship, you need to play a minimum required matches. And I believe that number is 9. And so Lerner will likely fall underneath that threshold in order to be eligible. But that would also assume that his ranking is high enough. And right now,
Hmm.
he's unranked. So
Yep.
he will not make it into the singles or doubles event.
It's crazy to think about what is required in terms of playing team events or singles events or championships for that matter, because Lerner could have played pro events. He could have played challengers. He could have played
Mhm.
25Ks. He could have played 15Ks. But instead, he's still going to be with the team. Even if they do go on a deep run, I'm just trying to visualize. If they do go on to the semifinals of the NCAAs and they say they win out the Pac-12,
Mhm.
would that be 9 matches? I'm just trying to think out loud here.
Yeah, I think for him, it's more about the ranking, right?
Yeah.
Because at that point, the individual rankings are including 15-ish wins,
Yeah.
right? So you have players, and that's from September to May, basically,
Yeah.
right? So for him at number 2, he's just not going to get the ranked wins, and he's going to be playing in the Pac-12 championship. That's clinch format, right? He might
Yeah.
not finish his matches. So
That's
I,
true.
I I think that ship has sailed in terms of being eligible. Now, the big thing for USC is they can use him to try and win a team championship, right? He'll be there, slotted there at probably 2, where he is right now, and that's a huge boost to that USC program.
And I think going on to conference championships, they are currently beginning, or at least some of them are beginning tomorrow. The Big 12 is probably one of the most looked at as of right now because of the amount of depth that it has. We had an upset today of Ole Miss over Mississippi State in the SEC today as well. I believe they were the 11 seed and
Yeah,
Mississippi State was 6.
yeah. So the Mississippi State men lost today, and then the Ole Miss women actually upset Auburn as well. So we're already
Wow.
starting to see some upsets in the conference tournaments, which you always expect. These teams know each other so well, right? They've played each other throughout the season, and you got to go back to back days here in these conference tournaments. So you're always going to see some upsets.
So for you, which conference would you say, or your personal favorite, is the most exciting to watch?
Mm. Well, this week, you mentioned conference tournaments have kicked off. There are 3 Power 5 conference tournaments this week. There is the ACC, there is the Big 12, and there is the SEC. Both men's and women's for both of those conferences are this week. It's really tough. I think on the men's side, the one that I find most intriguing is the SEC. The
Okay.
reason for that is the SEC men could potentially have 4 top 8 seeds in Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and South Carolina.
Oh,
Those
that's
are
right.
top 4 seeds in the SEC tournament. So there is not much that is separating those two in those 4 in the rankings right now. So ultimately, SEC tournament on the men's side going to determine a lot of NCAA seeding implications. On the women's side, look, it's tough not to go with the ACC on the women. They are by far the strongest conference. And what I'm really looking for there is if anyone can test North Carolina, right? They just went through an undefeated regular season. They won national indoors this year. They will likely be in the finals against either Duke or NC State. Very curious to see how much they get tested as they begin their postseason campaign.
For some reason, my mind just goes to NC State instead of UNC. And that's just how I've been seeing it with the amount of media attention that's been drawn to Diana and from them having top doubles players like Anna Rogers and her partner that's still on the team this year. For me, that's just where my mind goes with the ACC, at least, because besides Duke, I feel like NC State is the underdog, but also not at the same time for this championship.
It's funny you mentioned that. I was talking yesterday about the top storylines for these conferences. And when I think about the ACC, it is squarely NC State. Yeah. And the reason for that is because of all of the teams across the country, who has the personnel to knock off North Carolina? It's NC State, right? With Diana Schneider at the top of that lineup. And unfortunately, Diana Schneider went a little too far in the WTA event in Charleston, so she wasn't able to play that match against North Carolina. We were robbed of that match. So you kind of have this question mark, like, is NC State finally going to show that they really are top tier with North Carolina? Or is North Carolina going to say, those questions are nice, but we're still the top dog in the conference?
Are they, is UNC losing anyone after this year? They're losing Abby, aren't they?
Abby has another year. So of their top 6 singles players right now, every single one of them can come back.
That's
scary, right?
That's ridiculous. And we're seeing this, and I believe this year is the last year of, this year / next year is the last year of COVID eligibility, correct?
Exactly. This transfer class, we'll call them, so people who might be using their 5th years who would play in 2024, that's the last year. That's the last year,
because I think this year we're going to see a lot more. Those who don't follow college tennis as much, first of all, should. Second of all, Parsons has been doing a really good job with seeing who's being recruited, who's going where in terms of where everyone's transferring. But for tennis, some of the people that have transferred, I think the biggest one for me was Abby Forbes, that I knew, that everyone kind of knew on a greater scale, because she played at UCLA. And another one was who was her teammate that plays at SMU now?
Taylor Johnson.
Yeah, that was another one that switched, but those are the only two that I feel like made the impact when they switched schools.
Yeah, I think last year on the women's side, you did see more top-ranked players. You know, Abby Forbes in the previous season was high as number 2, right? She transfers from UCLA to UNC. The 2 other players I would call out are Alexa Noel, transferring from Iowa to Miami. Yep, she was a top 5 player at Iowa. She's now a top 5 player at Miami, and that's nationally, not just in the lineup there. And then the other player, you know, more so for the controversy and sort of being emblematic of this transfer era, was Cam Mora of North Carolina, transferring down Tobacco Road to Duke. So that one, I think, got a lot of attention.
That you have to have some guts to fully go down the road, because you don't even have to move. You could just stay in an apartment. And you could. You could commute to your new school now.
Yes.
Which is surprising to say. So if you were to pick, and this is where we're going to go into some predictions as well with the conference tournaments, which ones do you think have more upsets this year when it comes to the Power 5 conference in terms of the lower ranked seedings beating the top seeds?
I think of the conferences, it absolutely is going to be the Pac 12. And so that is something to watch next week. Both the men and the women kick off next week for the Pac 12. And the reason for that is that it has been, particularly on the men's side, it's been a pretty chaotic conference. There isn't really a top dog in the Pac-12 on the men's side this year. You have teams like Stanford who have been banged up. They go on the road, they lose to Utah. You have USC losing to Cal. There's just a lot of parity in the Pac-12 on the men's side this year. So I expect that maybe it's hard to even call them upsets, but in terms of being unpredictable, I think the Pac-12 men are certainly at the top of the list. And you look at last year, it's sort of a trend. You had number 1 seeded Arizona last year losing in their first round to Washington.
Mm-hmm.
So that tournament gets funky.
Okay.
And I think the reason why I also pick the Pac-12 on the women's side is you have 3 Pac-12 schools that are perennially very strong in Cal, USC, and UCLA.
Mm-hmm.
And all 3 of those teams really got off to a poor start this season. And they have all started to round into form. And you're starting to see the pieces that you thought were there on paper. Yeah. So that one I think could have upsets and just, again, unpredictability. That one is certainly one to watch next week.
I'm surprised of how much, going off the Pac-12 statement, I'm surprised how much it's evened out in terms of level.
Yeah.
Because you look at teams like USC, UCLA, even Cal that have history in college tennis, even Stanford. Excuse me for forgetting Stanford, but you see all these programs that build so high, do really good in recruiting, and then just level. Is there something going on there, or is that just kind of unlucky?
I would think it's more of a testament to the other programs around the country. I think one thing that has really impacted college tennis, I talked about with the depth, is just on the international level, right? Mm-hmm. We were seeing so much more interest from international junior players on coming to college. And that has been a really big advantage for teams that might not be the Stanfords of the world, right? And for the longest time, a Stanford women's program has been able to have the cream of the crop within the US. So if you wanted to compete with Stanford, you had to get creative. And oftentimes that meant going beyond the United States borders. Mm-hmm. And so you're starting to see a lot more programs that are finding talent elsewhere, right? Mm-hmm. So you now have a Utah women's program that has now beaten, Cal, USC, UCLA in just the last 2 years. And they're taking other things to do that, right? It's not going to be necessarily taking the top US recruits. I also think the other thing is that college athletics continues to be a booming business, right? We've seen that over the past few years with NIL, and tennis is the beneficiary of rising tides. And so as programs continue to invest in athletic facilities, even if they build a brand new training facility, guess who gets to take advantage of that oftentimes? It's the tennis players, right? So when they come on campus and they go to these visits, a lot of the facilities at these other schools are being able to match these kind of perennial powerhouses. And I think that's making a big difference in recruiting.
And I think too, and this is kind of a tangent, and this will be the last tangent before we get back on track, is with that international regard to tennis. And I believe tennis is either the first or second team, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the first or second sport in college tennis that's over 70% international.
I think 70. The last time I saw it, it was in the 60s.
60s. Thank you.
But it's certainly by far the most international sport of all NCAA sports.
Which is one, I think, great, because it allows international players to still compete at a high level and still get an education. But two, from what I've been told or what I've been hearing is, especially with NIL deals, it's hard for players that aren't American to get them, because you have to be an American in order to get an NIL deal here in the United States. Because, and yes, international players can get endorsements when they go back home and still be within that NIL criteria, but it's not the same because it's not where they're based 90% of the year, especially if they're still young in their college career. So for me, that's one thing that I've been noticing, at least when it comes to the amount of money being put into the sport in college, is the lack of NIL endorsements, I should say.
Yeah, it's sort of this paradox where, tennis is the most international sport, but because NIL does not allow for international players to take advantage of it, there are visa complications with that. Then you end up with a lot of really incredible college tennis players who can't take advantage of that, which is really unfortunate. I believe there is some legislation occurring now to adjust some of that for international players, but you look at larger revenue driving sports like a football, they don't have as big of an international contingent there. So they're not as concerned about can international players take advantage of NIL. But, it's certainly a big gap. And I would also like to see, even for the college tennis players who can take advantage of NIL, so the Americans there,
Mm-hmm.
it'd be great to see them start to expand their portfolio, right, of
Mm-hmm.
offerings, whether that is with local tennis, pro shops, or, larger tennis companies around the globe. I think it would be really exciting.
I think two people that came to mind immediately, and I don't know why this is, maybe because I just saw it on Instagram. Carson from Texas A&M just did a sponsored post for H&R Block, and she's
Okay. Yeah.
Canadian. Abby Forbes,
Well, she's dual citizen.
dual citizen. Thank you.
Yeah.
Dual citizen. Thank you. We're not getting you in trouble here, I promise. And Abby was a Buick ambassador when she was still at UCLA. I think she still is, but I'm not entirely sure, so I don't want to quote anything. But you have these players that are taking advantage, that have that star power and that potential. So it really does depend on how far we can push, or how well we can push what they come to school for, a student visa, to basically an employment visa, which is, I guess, the hardest part about this whole NIL process.
Yeah, there's certainly the challenges with international, but I also think that, for you and for me, and kind of profiling these players and raising their profile, hopefully that allows them to take advantage of more opportunities, right? I think one of the gaps I saw as being a college tennis fan was that there just wasn't college tennis being talked about like other sports, right? And sometimes that comes with pros and cons. Sometimes players and coaches aren't used to that, but ultimately, right, if we want to continue to see college tennis grow, and we know it's such a good product, there needs to be more media attention around it, and players can take advantage of that. And it's up to them if they want to really prioritize growing their social media presence and getting more involved with their local community, and kind of seeking out those opportunities, they can. And if they don't want to, or they don't feel like they need to, then that's totally a choice. But I hope more tennis players will have that option moving forward.
Absolutely. And to go back on track into college tennis and the end of the year tournament, conference tournaments, I think a more broader question for you is, who was the most surprising team that's doing so well this year? Which team caught your eye?
Yeah,
That's been doing this successfully this season.
I think across the men and the women, the easy answer here is the Iowa State women.
Okay.
And it has been a phenomenal season for Iowa State. So many program firsts that I can't even list. They were able to, they went to Miami, they upset Miami, they qualified for national indoors the first time in program history. They beat Texas there at the national indoors, the number one team in the country, first time in program history. There was just recently a fun stat. They beat Oklahoma State, first time in program history. They were 0 and
Oh yeah.
49 against Oklahoma State. No one beats Iowa State 50 times in a row, according to Coach Kilgo there. So the Iowa State women have been a phenomenal story. And, that's a team that is really based on international talent. It's a team that doesn't yet have the facilities that a lot of their peers, even just in their conference, like a Texas or an Oklahoma, have, but
Mhm.
they have found ways to win. They're an incredibly fun team to watch. They play with a lot of energy, and they've been winning a lot of matches that way. I mean, they've skyrocketed into the top 10 this season for the first time, and huge hats off to that program.
That's amazing. And for them too, in a conference like that, that's very rare. That's very rare to see with these kind of powerhouses. I was surprised about Miami too, because Miami is another one that, with Alexa Knoll, that caught my eye, especially
Mm-hmm.
when it came to their program.
Yeah, Miami is kind of on the Miami women, they're perennially top 16, right? And like flirting with that. And, over the years, they've certainly been number one in the country. If you look over the past few decades, they have had some good results this season, but they're
Mhm.
still in that like 12 through 16 range. For them, some of the challenges are with depth.
Yeah.
at the bottom of that singles lineup, where it's been a little disappointing on not finding those wins.
And they are, I believe, on senior day, they only honored one player. So they still have a lot of ability to go next year and play tremendously and to play better, to be honest.
Yeah, absolutely. And continuing to have Alexa Noel, who has struggled with injuries, but is now back in the top 5 in the country. I mean, she's an elite player in college tennis, right? So if you have her anchoring the top of your lineup, you're going to feel good about any match.
Absolutely. Would you also say that Iowa State men was the biggest surprise in terms of success, or is there another one you had in mind?
I would only be surprised by the Iowa State men if they actually had a program. So they don't have a program yet. But
My
I would love,
apologies.
yeah, no worries. I would love to see them have one.
Hmm.
On the men's side, I think one team that comes to mind is the Duke men.
Okay.
And, the Duke men, it's one of those programs where you look at the women who, always in kind of the top 8 conversation, making semifinals. They won the national championship in 2008, but the Duke men haven't yet been at that level. And in the ACC on the men's side, you've had, UVA kind of over the past 15 years has really been the story, but you've had Wake Forest sneak in a national championship in there. You've had North Carolina be at the top, but the Duke men have not been able to do it. And this season has been a game changer for them. For the first time in program history, they've run the table in the ACC, with the exception of their loss to Virginia. So first time in program history getting to 11 wins. They're the number 2 seed in the ACC tournament this year. I think it's been a really redeeming season for the Duke men, showing that they can put together a season that you would expect of such an elite, both academic and athletic institution. They're probably the team I circle as kind of their breakout season.
Isn't Duke getting another good recruit next year too? I'm
They
wrong.
do have a Spaniard as a freshman right now. You might be thinking of Pedro Rodinas.
Thank you. That's
Yes.
who I was thinking of. Okay, never
Yeah.
mind. Because I
Which and
believe
he's been excellent.
he's been excellent. I agree.
Mm-hmm.
For and kind of go the not I wouldn't say polar opposite, but you always have to talk about the ones that did really, really well, that exceeded your expectations, and then some that may have been disappointing.
Yeah.
Who would you say did not meet your expectations this year?
Well, I'm actually going to stay in the same conference for the women in the Big 12, and I think it's Oklahoma. And this is an
Okay.
Oklahoma team who had a similar season to Iowa State last year in terms of a lot of program firsts. They make the NCAA final for the
Hmm.
first time, and they returned all 6 of the same singles players that they made that run in 2022 with. And it's
Hmm.
been a struggle for them. They've been kind of hovering around the 20-ish ranking. They seem to be starting to play a lot better. I think they're
Hmm.
a team to circle on, can they find that postseason magic? But I think people were expecting to see them still in the national championship conversation, and they kind of took a step back this year, which was more on the disappointing side.
How about on the men's side?
Mhm. I don't know if you're going to like this answer, but I think it has to be Wake Forest. And the reason
Mm.
I say Wake Forest is, this is a team that is not so far removed from winning the national championship in 2018. And since then has been unable to find that level. And I think Coach Tony Bresky is one of the best coaches in the country at extracting as much value from his team that you can humanly extract. And that hasn't been enough yet to kind of sit at the top of the ACC. They're the 6th seed going into that ACC tournament, and that's just not where we're used to seeing Wake Forest men's tennis.
Even and staying in that same conference too, another program that we visited as well. First of all, that did hurt a little bit, I will say, John.
Sorry.
It's okay. The second part team that I wanted to mention was NC State. NC State took Texas to a 4-3 loss. Actually, I thought they had it at one point when they were playing at Texas. Rafa beat Elliot Spizzirri at that number 1 spot as well. And Rafa's, I believe, top 60 right now for
Yeah, that feels
singles.
right.
And they have 2 teams inside the top 40 for doubles as of right now. And Luca Nardi is also in the top 100 for the men's team. So that I feel like that's a team that had a slow start to the season, but is now picking up the steam to where we can see them playing some of the better end at the end of the season.
Yeah, I'm very intrigued to see how they do in the ACC tournament. they had a better ACC season than their ITA ranking indicates. They're, in a top 4 seeding position there in the ACC. They started a little bit slow, but you're right. They've picked it up towards the tail end of the ACC. It was a team that returned a lot of talent from last year. And those were always the teams that you try and circle and say, hey, this is probably posed for a run. They've probably gotten a lot of experience this year. Next year, they could really kind of take another leap. The one other thing I'll say about, teams that we haven't maybe seen as much production from is the Pac-12 overall. I think on the men's side, you have a Stanford team that is loaded with talent, but just has not been healthy at all, right? You had freshman Nishesh Basavareddy suffer a wrist injury. They've been struggling with that. And I already mentioned kind of those 3 Pac-12 teams that we're used to seeing kind of up in the top of the rankings, not there in Cal, UCLA, and USC. So, a lot of eyes on some of those teams we just talked about to see if they can kind of salvage some of their seasons with good postseason play.
And in terms of postseason play, this is kind of, I did not ask you this question, but it just popped into my head. There was a little bit of a switch in Ivy League teams in the top 10 rankings this year between Columbia and Harvard. Which one do you see going farther in the NCAA tournament?
Oh, that's a really good question. It's been tough for these Ivy teams. They had no 2021 season, right? So last year was the first season back, trying to get the pieces together. Both Harvard and Columbia pre-COVID and the 2021 shutdown have been at the top of men's tennis. They just played this past weekend. Harvard wins that match. Columbia was missing a top 6 singles player. They'll both probably be seeded 12 through 16, assuming they're both seeded and therefore they can host the first 2 rounds. I'm going to go Columbia has a better shot at an upset when they go on the road in the round of 16.
Okay. I like that.
And I'll add some color there. I think at the top of that lineup, they have freshman Michael Zhang, who's been really solid for them. And they have, a veteran in Alex Kotson, who's playing a little lower in the lineup. And I think that's where they're finding a lot of success. So it was 4-3 when they played. Columbia was missing a guy. Assuming Rocco is back in the lineup, I would keep your eye out on Columbia.
I 100% agree, because I think they've switched positions a couple of times throughout the season in terms of entering that top 10 seeding position for the end of the year tournament. So, in one thing I wanted to get your opinion on is, for these NCAA tournaments and bracketology, at least, before I ask this next question, the one I wanted to say was, how do you see, I feel like in college tennis compared to basketball or football, you don't really see a big upset in the first round. There's never really a low seed beating a top seed. And I feel like it's so much harder to do in tennis versus in other sports where yes, it's that team aspect, but there's so many other factors that go into it when it comes to a tennis match.
Yeah, I mean, one factor is it's a team, but it's also one-on-one, right?
Yeah.
And so you have to have upsets in not just one match. You have to have upsets in at least 3 singles matches, if not 4, if you don't drop the doubles point. In doubles, you have to have upsets in 2 matches to get the doubles point. So I do think that compounds. If you say, okay, they have a 20% chance of winning, well, they have to do that in a few spots. And so I think that's one of the differences between like true team sports, where you're all on a field or a court together, versus tennis, which is a accumulation of individual points. I think that's one of the bigger factors. But look, I also think, it's more and more common now to see these upsets in basketball than it might have been 10 to 20 years ago. And it would not surprise me to start to see that become more and more common in tennis as more teams are, having that depth, finding different players across the world. I think we will start to see that become more common.
I think it's bound to happen with the amount of international players coming in, with the amount of growth some of these programs are seeing. But going into that college tennis end of the year tournament, I don't know why I always like to go, I guess maybe because it's a little bit more interesting, but when it comes to top seeds right now in the top 10 rankings for the men, that's the women. The men, you have Texas, Ohio State, TCU, Georgia, Kentucky, South Carolina, Michigan, Virginia, Tennessee, and Harvard. Which one of those teams do you think is going to be knocked out first?
Of the tournament.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you immediately circle the teams that probably will not be a top 8 seed, right? Because
Yeah.
now with the way that they've structured the NCAA tournament, now you get to host the Sweet 16 if you're a top 8 seed. So that matters significantly. So
Mhm.
you talked about Harvard there. They will be outside of the top 8. That's going to mean that they're at least on the road for that Sweet 16 match. So I think that that's going to be a struggle. One team that you mentioned there that could still have a shot at a top 8 ranking that I would circle as maybe one that could go out early or maybe prone to upsets would be South Carolina. South Carolina had a good indoor season. They got a very good early season outdoor win over Ohio State in Ohio State's kind of first outdoor match, but they kind of struggled in the SEC season. They lost 4 matches in the SEC. So if they're able to keep a top 8 seed, I think that that's one. If you're a 9 to 16 seed, you probably want to end up in South Carolina.
That's probably true. How about in the women? Because for the women right now, UNC, Texas, Michigan, Georgia, NC State, Duke, Stanford. Also, another team that I forgot to mention earlier with the California teams, Pepperdine, Ohio State, and then rounding off with Virginia.
Yeah, so I think of the top teams here on the women's side, the one most on upset alert is going to be Michigan. And this is sort of emblematic of the Big Ten in terms of having solid indoor results. You go outdoors and things are a little different. So I do expect that Michigan, they'll be a top 8 seed, but there's going to be a lot of very feisty and, battle tested SEC teams, for example, that might be ranked 14, 15, 16 that need to go on the road and play Michigan. And assuming that match is outdoors in Ann Arbor, I think Michigan might have some trouble.
Because at the 11 to 20 spot, you got Iowa State, Texas, Miami, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Auburn. You have at least 3 SEC schools.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can envision a world where if Michigan holds on to their number 3 ranking, or maybe they're 4 or 5, and they get Florida on the road and you get a nice 78-degree day in Ann Arbor, like Florida's going to be loving that. Right. And you saw that those two teams actually, I use Florida as an example because Michigan did the opposite. They went down to Florida, played Florida, and it was not close at all. Florida got the win there outdoors. So, yeah, I think Michigan is on upset alert, but it's still been a phenomenal season for the Michigan women.
So who's going to be your Cinderella this year?
Well, Iowa State has already been the Cinderella on the women's side. I think they are. It doesn't really matter what they end up doing. It's historic. They are absolutely the Cinderella. One team I would say, hey, watch out for, we haven't talked about, is Georgia Tech on the women's side. That's a team that is in a very tough ACC conference. I could see them getting in, they'll probably be a 2 seed somewhere in one of the regions. I'd circle it for them. Oklahoma women, I would keep my eye out on them. On the men's side, it'll be interesting. We haven't had a breakout star, if you will, on Cinderella in terms of teams that I think have the potential to do that. I think Stanford. I think the Stanford men, if they get healthy, you have Arthur Ferry, top 5 player in the country, Nishesh Basavareddy, if healthy, he's a top 10 player in the country. Samir Banerjee, former Wimbledon junior champion, Max Bates. They just have so much talent up top.
Yeah.
That is a very scary team if they are healthy.
I agree. And another team that caught my eye this year, and I'll make this my last one for you, because Northwestern was a team that I didn't really pick to be a top 30 team looking at it right away. What made them special to get into this 26 ranking?
Well, they have been kind of hovering in that range, and they had a few good early wins this season. They bring back a lot of experience on that team. They have some 5th years on that team, and that really pays dividends. What I have found is that, when you have more experience, you can schedule a lot smarter because you don't feel the need to schedule maybe easier matches. You can schedule tougher, knowing that, hey, I have got seniors on this team, so they know what to expect. They've played at these places. We're going to go and schedule tough. And Northwestern did that with some early season out of conference matches. They played NC State. They got that win. That win has appreciated over time. And they did that early in the season. And if you're a Big Ten team where you don't have as many quality wins in the conference, it's really smart scheduling by the coach there.
100%, 100%. This is my last question. We talked about, you've mentioned your bubble watch for
Hmm.
the men's and women's team. I
Hmm.
have the women's up right now, and maybe we'll mention the men as well. So far, you said your last four in were Clemson, Arkansas, Denver, and San Diego State. And your
Hmm.
first four out are UCF, Boston College, LSU, and Arizona.
Hmm.
Walk us through your decisions with these.
So there's a few factors that go into this.
Mm-hmm,
The first is the 500 rule.
mm-hmm,
And to be eligible for the NCAA tournament, you have to have at least a 500 record on your conference season. That UCF team is a great example. They do not have a 500 record. They're one match shy. So unless they do very well in the conference tournament, they're out because they don't have enough matches. The cut line typically in the way that the NCAA tournament works is you either get in two ways. One, because you win your conference and you get the auto bid, or second, you're an at large, and that is pretty much based on rankings. And so when you look at this, the cut line typically is around the 42 to 46 ranking. And that's how you sort of factor this in. You look at sort of, okay, who is going to be a guaranteed at large, who's kind of the conference leader, who might get the conference bid. The biggest thing to call out, I think, in these bubble watch is in that list, you hear a lot of, or at least I featured a lot of non-power five teams. So you talk
mm-hmm,
about a UCF, talk about an SMU or a Charlotte. A lot of those teams have their conference tournaments either this week or next, and
mm-hmm.
those are play-in events for them, because if they win the conference, then they get the auto bid. If they don't, they might not have the ranking to get in. So those are sort of the factors that go into this, both the 500 rule and your ITA ranking. And it's tough because the conference tournaments happen. There's so many teams. You talk about a Clemson, for example, like
Yeah.
they won their first round match and then lose their second round match. So they're going to be waiting to see the selection show in 2 weeks.
And how about the men? Do you have your 4 and 4?
Yeah, I can go through that.
Yes, that would be
Uh,
great.
yeah. Okay. And some of this information is being pulled from College Tennis Ranks as well, who does kind of a similar. So right now, the Alabama men are ineligible because of the 500 record. So they are the first one of the on the outside looking in,
Mm-hmm.
and then outside on the cut line you have Nebraska, UCF, and SMU. So similar theme here with some
Ooh.
of these teams where the non-power five, like a UCF or an SMU, just on the outside looking in.
Yeah.
The last four in right now are UTSA, who
Okay.
benefits from a win over Texas A&M earlier this season. Arizona State, who still has some, room on the board, if you will, because they have the Pac-12 tournament to come.
Yeah.
Miami, who will have a tough match against Virginia in the
Mm.
ACC, and then Oklahoma State. Now, Oklahoma State on the men's side,
Okay.
they have the double whammy because they are currently 12 and 12, and they are right on the cut line. And they have their conference matchup against Texas Tech, who they lost to earlier this year. They lose that match, they're out, and they're out, one, because of the 500 rule, and two, it probably put them outside the cut line. And a win, they're in. So a lot of fun calculations here down the home stretch on these cut lines.
How much research do you put into this?
Well, I will say that on the cut lines, the College Tennis Ranks is a fabulous resource. And so, I leverage that pretty significantly. But it's really interesting to understand sort of like how the NCAA thinks about the selection criteria. The seeding criteria is a whole different conversation. So it gets fun down the home stretch to really kind of game out these potential results.
And for me too, looking at, I'm currently on bookmarking this immediately, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Bookmarking immediately. Um, TCU isn't the
Mhm.
outright favorite anymore, are they?
No, I think you have to go Texas, right? The number one team. They've beaten TCU twice this season, lost once at indoors, but hey, NCAA's is outdoors and they've won the 2 outdoor matches. So Texas will be your number one seed in the NCAA tournament,
Hmm.
regardless of what happens in the Big 12 tournament.
Because they already clinched Big 12 regular season and they already have the best record in college tennis.
Yeah, well, and just from a rankings perspective, they've kind of built up enough of a gap between the 2 and the 3 seeds in
Okay,
Ohio State and TCU.
that's fair. Well, John, I really do appreciate you coming on. We'd love to have you on again sometime in the future, and maybe even do a live stream too with some of the college tennis matches that are coming up. But if you guys want to follow John and his insight, his literally everything that has to do with college tennis, please follow him on Twitter at jtweets10. Follow his No Ad, No Problem podcast. All the links to those are down in the description below. And I really appreciate you guys staying this long. If you stayed this long, make sure you subscribe with notifications turned on. I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you, John, again, and I really appreciate it.